Thank you so much, President Folt, for sitting down with us in your office today to have this conversation. You wrote a great letter to our community, trying to explain a little bit about what's gone on and what the university can do better about creating a safe space for our students here on campus. And we appreciate the opportunity to have a conversation, a direct conversation today about those topics.
It's wonderful to be with you today. I'm just thinking today it was convocation on a new year, and we're back in person, and it's really nice to have this conversation together.
You know, on the one hand, I do believe that we need to focus on the positives. We're lucky enough to have an amazing Jewish community at USC, and the university has been incredible at creating a safe space for its students, for all of its students. And that's really the main area of focus, is knowing that we're doing right by our students and continuing to do so. At the same time, anytime there's any type of negativity or anti-Semitism, that's something that really hits close to home for our students and for ourselves. And we all know that unfortunately anti-Semitism has been on the rise around the country in recent years. We know that it's by far the most common religious form of hate crime that exists still today. And it's also, it hits very close personally to each of us. My own family, my great-grandparents were killed in the Holocaust. It's not so long ago. My grandparents, who I knew, they lost their family. And, Runya's grandfather was in the gulags by Stalin for the crime of being a Jew, being a proud Jew, and teaching Judaism. So it's not ancient history. It's very real to our community, to us. Even just this week, I did a baby naming for an alum's son, sorry, and Briss, and her grandmother came over to talk to me after the ceremony, and she shared about how she saw her parents for the last time at 9 years old, how a Polish neighbor sold her to the Gestapo for 5 pounds of sugar, sold her out and gave her away, brought her in. And miraculously, she was able to survive that and make her way through the camps and survive and build a family. So this is something that's still very real and touches very, very close to home for our community. Whenever there's issues of hatred, of people expressing things that are not friendly and are not safe.
Actually, the funny thing is that we had Friday night dinner this past week, and we had a bunch of students over, and we posed the question asking them how they felt about what happened this past week in Texas with the hostage situation in the synagogue. And most of them felt, and the sentiment that they expressed, they felt very alone. They said that they felt that the media, their friends on social media, weren't really being allies or not really expressing and saying things and being there for them. And they felt that a lot of times when it's another minority group, they're there to support them, and everyone else is saying things and making media posts, and they felt that people weren't doing it for them. And so we wanted really now to be able to, be there for the students and let them feel that they do have, the university being there for them, and they shouldn't feel alone in this.
So while we want to focus on the future, not so much on the past, that's what gives relevance to the conversation. First and foremost, not so much as actionable, but what would be, in your opinion, the line at which acceptable speech is crossed?
We'll just go right to it about what is speech. And there really are different ways. I like the way you set it up. How do we want people to be in a classroom? How do we want them to be part as neighborly, to be friends, to be very good citizens versus what is legally accepted? So let's talk about that first category first. And I think we want a place where people can feel that they belong. We want a place where people will challenge each other. This is a learning environment. It's not about everybody marching to the same drum. We're not trying to make everybody sound alike, look alike, act alike. That is not it. We want them to be their best selves. But I don't think you're ever your best selves if the main thing you're trying to do is be very personal, ad hominem at people. I think I've heard you say you never attack the person, you might be very upset or you might be very strong about the idea, and those are very often the acceptable differences when you're after people versus ideas. And I think at universities, we're usually pretty good at that distinction. We're very good at it in the classroom, not perfect, but we don't allow people to sit in classes and start attacking individuals, and even things that might be protected speech online are not things that are disruptive and allowed. But debate is, and openness to difference, and the idea that you might feel very, very strongly and passionately about political and those sorts of differences have to be something universities try to take on. So I think that doesn't mean we have a certain sort of conversation, but we have time and place for certain sorts of conversation. What's acceptable in a classroom is very different than what you might try to have people talk about when they're in your living room or around your table, and might be very different what I welcome if a student comes to see me and they're talking to me in my office and they want to express something that's really concerning to them. There are different things they might say, and that's all acceptable speech. That is very different when you start getting to be threatening, and I think we can talk more about that. But also, even threats are very different, whether they are physical threats, whether we hang emblems that are very destructive to people. Physical threats are never okay, but emblematic threats and conversations can be accepted by free speech in America. So the most important thing a university has to do is try to have conversation about this so people understand what those distinctions are, and we work every day to make spaces where these conversations about troubling issues can be had in a way that we can feel will help, not stop conversation.
So when is something that you could actually be actionable?
So that's interesting about actionable speech. And again, we could probably come up with many different examples, and some would seem actionable and some would not. But of course, we have a free speech law, and we call it protected speech. Most speech is protected, but when it starts being an actual threat to a named person, to a place, I'm going to show up at X, Y, and Z, and I expect to do that. Those time and place distinctions are very clear, and they start becoming threats that are immediately actionable. They can also be, the way an actionable threat would come through, if we saw something, if someone brought it to us, said this has come through, we immediately go to law enforcement and to the FBI, and we say, is this protected speech? And so they're looking for things. Is it time, place? Is it delineated as a person? And is there any reasonable means to believe that this could be more than just talk? And that's why when you read about it in the paper, you see really hateful things being said often that are not actionable, because that's free speech. And I think we're in a real push and pull in America right now, because a lot of it seems very destructive and doesn't seem to promote the conversation, but it is protected. California is interesting, and we talked about that, because these free speech rights especially apply in public areas, in public universities, in government-owned places. But California passed its own law called the Leonard Law specifically for its private universities, including USC, to say we are subject to the exact same free speech protections, which means that we can't take sanctions or discipline people for saying and doing things that are protected by free speech. But that's not the same as what we can do when someone disrupts our activities and comes into our classrooms or goes into our dorms. But those are the distinctions, and they're very hard sometimes to live with.
Right, which I think brings up the next question then. What do you do when there's speech that isn't acceptable but also isn't actionable? And is there a perception? I mean, I think definitely people have a perception that certain types of speech, or against certain types of hate speech, certain types of minorities, there would be a public outcry and things would immediately change. Runya mentioned earlier the perception sometimes among Jewish students today that maybe anti-Semitism isn't treated quite the same. What could it do, and what lessons are we looking to learn about what it could do to still create a safe space?
So I think there's a lot that you packed into that question,
Sorry.
which you do very well. So I'll try to pull it apart a little bit. For one, what the university does in the case of speech, and I'm going to say online speech, or it can be other forms of harassment, we do try very hard to do the same in all cases. And I know people don't know it, but I see many threats that perceived threats that might be online. We get many, many complaints. And we treat them the same. And we have a team that reaches out, tries to understand it. They will reach out to the student. They will also try to offer support to the people that brought it forward. We don't, as you know, go out ever and call out individual students and talk about their discipline. That violates every privacy law. It also violates my belief in what our role as educators is. You know, I'm still trying in every case to educate people, and I'm trying to find a way that we can change that kind of discourse. And I just look at you both and know that that's what you do all the time. So I think you have different levels, but the responses are the same. I can't control what the public decides, how they respond, but how I would respond is the same. And even in the time I've been here, I've made a number of public comments, a number of letters that I've sent to the community about very disrespectful and painful behavior across many different topics. I don't think you do that every single time, though. The Twitter world is a hateful world, filled with things that you don't want to do. I think we have to aspire to be better at teaching. We clearly need to work with our students to understand why that isn't a good way to solve things, why the person is more important than that way of acting. How can we be there for students to help them understand when that happens? They don't have to own that their feelings of being treated so poorly, but they have places they can go. So we certainly have to be better at saying, if you're feeling these things, come to us. How can we help work with it? And we work with both of the parties in these people that might be making such statements. We're trying very hard there to have them understand why that may be very different than what we expect in a university community, at the same time to support a different way of speaking, in the same way trying to reach out to our students who are feeling fearful or feeling dismissed or targeted. And we have many groups that can feel that right now. So I think we have to try to get to that position of leadership in education and listening. You know, every time someone tells you they're feeling pain, you can't just say, well, that's protected speech, don't feel pain. I mean, I would hate it if that's what I felt our answer was too. So, you know, we're learning a lot. I learn every single day that I talk to someone, and I think we're learning about that. How can we both listen and understand what it feels like, but also help people realize what the world and what these things are allowed and which ones are not allowed on a university. So my last thing I want to say there, and we can come back to it, is we think that we really do need to provide our students with a very clear code of conduct. Now, that code of conduct does not mean that we can break free speech, but it talks about what environment do we want, and how do we expect people to uphold the idea that you might disagree, but you don't want to make people feel unsafe and not belonging. And I think if we can get that done, we would probably ask all students to at least agree to have read it and think about what it means to adhere to it. I'm very optimistic we can find that, and using that as a vehicle, we can maybe work with people to really rethink this way of communicating that can be so painful, you know, cause distrust.
Right, so practically, like in day-to-day, what is USC like doing? What are actionable items that USC is doing that the students feel that they have like a strong and like an environment, like to be able to create like a, you know, community here? They feel like they're, you know, everyone's behind them and backing them. And
so I'll tell you a few things that I'm going to tell you from the start, that you and people and the Hillel group, the Kasdan Institute, the Shoah Foundation, some of our leaders in the Jewish community have been extremely helpful to me and others to think about how can we start putting a little bit more definition to that, because I think it is really important. And so we did create a committee, and I know that, thank you, Rabbi Dov, you're going to be on it, and others with people on campus and not, to really look at some of these issues, including, do we need to adopt a definition of anti-Semitism and how do we deal with Zionism. And I mean, these are really important issues, but we need to think about them and we need to get input and counsel from people. And we do have groups like that that work in other areas of cultural affinity, and we need that. And I think it's a wonderful suggestion, and everybody I asked joined immediately. So I'm excited by that. And faculty are in it, students are in it. So I think they will have some really strong suggestions. Dean Soni also convened a group not just about 6 months ago to come up with some very practical things that we can including trying to find ways to have kosher food that is warm on campus and get more support for our students. And that includes support for our Palestinian and our Muslim students as well. So we need to add. I think there are things that we can add in that way. And we can be supportive of several big campaigns, and I've been reading all about them. How do we do better trainings? And students very much want us to include these trainings as part of our mandatory harassment training, and we will be doing that. But we're going to need help from the Jewish community as we think about that, and help just as we seek it out from other groups when we're trying to find training that would really be useful. Some people think we should be even doing that in training as we do for all of our IFC members and our student leaders, and there are some wonderful examples, some of it built right here, where we can get people trained. And you don't just do it once. New students, every term, you have to have that be repeated. So I think getting better services, having a better understanding of what really would support Jewish life, working with the amazing communities that we have in place, putting in better services, and that harassment training is important. It was also asked that we would make sure that someone from the Jewish community was on any sort of DEI council that we put in place. We will absolutely do that. Some of these are underway, and the committee will give us real help on that. And we've also just renamed one of the buildings who had been named for someone who had a very strong anti-Semitic history. And so I think we keep working on every front, and I am certain that I'm going to get a lot of suggestions I have not yet thought about. And I think we're open.
It's amazing. Thanks for spearheading.
We're looking forward to being part of that process, and I think it really is incredible. We've been here on campus for 20 years, and more than 20 years, and I've seen USC changing over the years. We all know that in the past this was not seen as a place that necessarily Jewish students felt seen. There were always Jewish students and Jewish faculty at USC, but we once had a parent of an alum tell us that when he saw a picture of the Hanukkah event on campus, that when he was a student at USC, he knew there were other Jewish students, but he always felt like he was the only one. And thankfully, I think that's changed a lot over the years. And we really appreciate your leadership in working to make sure that, that people know that Israel won't be unfairly demonized, that students who support that, while respecting that there's other opinions, are going to feel safe and know that they're able to stand up for who they are and what they believe here on campus. As well as Jewish students as a whole, and making sure that we continue to have these conversations. I think so often nowadays people like shouting at each other, and we really appreciate that you're willing to sit down and have a hard conversation about how do we look at these things deeper, and how do we find the right steps to navigate between the acceptable and the actionable, and try to bring them a little closer together.
Well, I really appreciate your saying that, and I do. Again, I go back to where does it really start? And I think it starts in all the organizations that you and others have put in place here for many years. And I'm just thinking about the Hanukkah celebration. There were a lot of people there, and I don't know, there were maybe 400 students the night that I came for Shabbat there. And, we just have a very great legacy. And we have actually quite a large population of Jewish students here. And I think that's something that's really wonderful. It does really seem very different than what had taken place earlier and not that long ago. So it's still, and as you said, it's very real for people here. But also, even when you go to some of the events that the Shoah Foundation puts on, we have international leadership in our students. The Hebrew Union College teaches in runs basically our Jewish study program. So we have a lot of tools here, and I'd love to think that we could be a real leader in this. And I really appreciate all that you do.
Thank you.